Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to the second panel of this, the 20th International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. As I just said, 20th, I cannot believe that we have done this 20 times and we are still here. But I think it is absolutely important to mention the fundamental fact that this whole conference is the work of a team which has been working on organizing it for months, and with all the unpredictable issues that arise as a result of organizing conferences and then having a war start in the middle of it. I first and foremost, I want to express a personal gratitude to Professor Ardi Kia. Ardi, please stand up, co-director of the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center. Outstanding work as always. Also, I want to express my personal thanks to Chris Hislop, the president of the Montana World Affairs Council. Chris, please stand up and be recognized. Montana World Affairs Council has been an amazing force of enlightenment and education, and we truly appreciate Chris and his staff for being there with us, supporting us every step of the way, and we truly appreciate it. Also, without my great friend and colleague, Bob Seidenschwartz. Bob, you have to stand up for this one. As we watched, I watched with absolute fascination, outstanding presentation by Montana National Guard, Montana Army National Guard. I was reminded of our trips to Central Asia and realized how much even one trip can change you in terms of understanding the world and all its issues. I want all three of you to stand up and be recognized for your amazing work and service to the United States. We are privileged to have you with us. With all that said, I also want to express my gratitude to University of Montana for hosting this conference and for being there for us. And with no further ado, I think what we will do is go 1, 2, 3. So we will start with my great colleague, Michael Mayer. And Mike also needs a special attention because he has been through this from the beginning with us. And Mike, I think we should also give you a standing ovation. Please stand up and be recognized. I think our radio shows are not the first Tuesday of every month on KGVO 1290 has become sort of a habit for the two of us to be together and talk. But Mike will start, we will then follow with Bob, and then I will make some remarks about the situation, the unfolding situation in the region. I will try at least to have a more overall sort of analysis of the situation on the ground today, with some focus on the unfolding war in Israel. But Mike will start with an emphasis on U.S. foreign policy and its various aspects with regard to Israel and the surrounding region. Michael Mayer, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Mehrdad and Ardi. I don't know if people have given this much thought, but this is the 20th time they've done this. And I ran one conference back in the 1980s. I was teaching in New Zealand, and the Australian New Zealand American Studies Association had an annual conference. They wanted it to be in Auckland, so it was dumped in my lap. And I learned that most academics do one conference. They find out how much work it is, how much trouble it is, and they never do it again. And it's one reason why these conferences are such a mess, because everybody's learning from scratch the first time around, and nobody ever has any experience to do it. And there, as Meredith said, there are things that come up that you can't imagine. A war is a little exceptional, but one of the things that we had on the agenda for the conference that I ran in Auckland was a movie by some American producers who it was a documentary on American populism, and we figured we'd show it the night of the conference dinner. And I learned in the afternoon that the film was seized by the film censor. It's illegal to show, or at least it was back then, illegal to show a film in New Zealand if it hasn't been cleared by the film censor. And so I'm sitting there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 hours before this thing's supposed to go on. And it took the intervention of 2 cabinet members to get the thing out, and it got there about 15 minutes before. And my blood pressure still hasn't recovered. And as I said, Meredith's done this 20 times. And I just, and the quality from the beginning of this is astonishing, and it should be recognized. What I'm going to try to do is give some sort of overview and some context to Joe Biden's policy toward the Middle East. And some might say, is there one? Well, setting all jokes aside, I think you can see some contours that make sense, and I hope it'll lay some groundwork for what Meredith's going to be talking about a little later. Let me begin by saying that I think that the Middle Eastern policy of this administration has been at times wrong-headed, even foolish. And I think it's been driven in large part by the ideology of Biden and his advisors. And I think it's also been compounded by a degree of naivety. They tend to see the world the way they think it should be, rather than the way it actually is. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, recently said that the Middle East was more quiet than it had been for 2 decades. And he added that he spent far less time on the Middle East than any of his immediate predecessors. That's one I bet you he wishes he had back. I'm thinking that might not have been one that will stand up under the examination of time. But especially when you look at the personnel, the Biden administration is, in a lot of ways, Obama 1.1. I didn't say 2.0, because remember the old days when they used to increase these just a little bit, and they weren't really improvements. They just made you spend more money to get a new version. I think that's what we've got here. Robert Malley, who was the lead negotiator for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, and an advocate of rapprochement with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, was Biden's special envoy to Iran. That was until this year, when his security clearance was revoked for mishandling classified documents. He was put on first paid, then unpaid leave, and now the FBI is conducting a criminal investigation. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was the deputy chief of staff to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in the Obama administration. And Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was deputy national security advisor and deputy secretary of state under Obama. After that, he was managing director of the Biden Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and then orchestrated a letter by 15 former national security officials maintaining that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. Now, let me make it clear. I'm not arguing that Biden or his administration is responsible for Hamas's attack on Israel. Far from it. But I do think that the policies of this administration led to conditions that set the stage for the attack that did take place. First, I want to look at relations with Israel. Biden and his administration were consistently hostile to Benjamin Netanyahu's new government after it won election. It wasn't the kind of hostility that the Obama administration had displayed, but there was a fair bit of animosity. And in his typically inarticulate way, Biden said, I think it's a mistake to think that as some of the members of his cabinet, and this is one of the most extreme members of cabinets that I have seen. I think I know what he meant by that. But beyond that, Biden pursued policies that certainly the Israelis considered contrary to their interests. 3 weeks into the administration, he announced plans to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council. The United Nations Human Rights Council has made bashing Israel its primary focus for a number of decades. The administration might have held out for some reform in exchange for its reentry, but it chose not to. 3 months into the administration, they restored funding to the Palestinians that Trump had suspended. That was $230 million. Even though they did this, even though the Palestinian Authority continues to maintain a martyrs fund. They pay $300 million a year to terrorists or their next of kin who murder Israelis. This makes it illegal for the United States directly to give money to the Palestinian Authority, but the Biden administration has managed to do so through other channels, mainly the UN Relief and Works Agencies, which is notably hostile to Israel. For example, they've distributed textbooks used in Palestinian schools that have justified jihad violence and grotesque anti-Semitism. And even with the more, I hesitate to use the term moderate, but the Palestinian Authority. Recently, Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech in which he said Hitler killed Jews because of their, quote, social role, and he cited usury. He said the same thing in 2017, 2018. He also said that European Jews are not Semites. They're not from the Holy Land. They're not descended from the Israelites, but from Khazars who converted, which is just absolute nonsense. But his point was very clear that Jews do not belong in the Holy Land. He said that Britain and the United States invented the Jewish state. And it's not the first time he said these things. He said these things repeatedly over the years. The fact is that there's a certain naivety. The Palestinian Authority, or at least its leadership, really does not want a two-state solution. They're interested in the eradication of Israel as Hamas is. And again, the eradication of Israel, and indeed the eradication of Jews, is part of the Hamas charter. During his first year in office, Biden attempted to reopen diplomatic missions of Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. The government of the then Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, which included, by the way, left of center parties and the Arab parties, blocked that. In March of 2023, this year, Biden publicly snubbed Netanyahu, who had just won the general election, and said he would not be receiving him in Washington in the near term. The reason given was the judicial reforms proposed by the new coalition government of Israel. I want to take a minute and talk about that because there are accusations that these reforms are anti-democratic. And by the way, opponents of the government in Israel made the same allegations. But the fact is, Netanyahu's government is moving to restructure the power of the Supreme Court. In Israel, now, Supreme Court justices are chosen by sitting justices and lawyers, elite lawyers from the Bar Association. The proposals to reform the system involve bringing politicians into the process, not making it exclusively the domain of politicians, but bringing them into the process. Now, I don't know if that's the best system for Israel or not, but the fact is, it's not undemocratic. Israel has no written constitution. Its Supreme Court in the last 25 years has become increasingly powerful and intrusive. And in the absence of a constitution, decisions declaring acts of the Knesset, the parliament, unconstitutional lack a clear basis in law. The court has used a reasonable test. Is a law reasonable? Well, oh my God, can you imagine if we had that here? We really would have a mess. And it's interesting, the Biden administration urged restraint in going forward with this. Someone needs to remind the president that justices in the United States are chosen exclusively by politicians. They're nominated by the president, an elected official, and confirmed by the Senate, elected officials. But I think those divisions in Israeli society certainly encouraged or made more likely the Hamas attack. In June of this year, the Biden administration ended scientific and technological cooperation with Israeli entities in the West Bank and Golan Heights and in Jerusalem. And even Biden's, quote, national strategy to counter anti-Semitism undermined the American commitment to using the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's globally accepted definition of anti-Semitism. That standard is accepted by the European Union, 35 other countries, and the Obama administration. But the Biden administration's document refers to, quote, several definitions that can serve as valuable tools and mentions the Nexus document. And that document maintains that expressions of, quote, intense hostility toward pro-Israeli Jews is anti-Semitic only when it provokes violence. But I think above all, the Biden administration represents a return to an earlier American approach to the Middle East. You see this in the foreign policy of George H.W. Bush and Obama and Clinton. All of these administrations believed that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was the key to peace in the Middle East. And all of those administrations, both parties, believed that that could be achieved by exerting pressure on Israel to make concessions, and it did not work. I think the most problematic, or maybe even the most dangerous policy, is the tilt toward Iran. Biden bent over backward to resurrect some version of Obama's Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which gave Iran billions of dollars in sanctions relief in exchange for woefully inadequate restrictions. Biden knew that he wasn't going to get a comprehensive agreement, and he also knew that he couldn't get a treaty like Obama. They therefore both decided to circumvent congressional review and sought informal arrangements. The Biden administration made concessions, reversed the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions imposed by the Trump administration, and gave the regime access to billions of dollars in frozen funds. And they received virtually nothing in return. Today, Iran has more money than it had 3 years ago. And that money has supported a tyrannical regime at home and terrorism abroad, and has funded Hezbollah and Hamas. Let me just give you an example. At the end of 2020, Iran had $4 billion in accessible foreign exchange. At the end of 21, it was 31.4 billion. And at the end of last year, it was 42.9 billion. Iranian oil exports increased substantially last year. And all this is going on while US and Iranian proxies were exchanging missile strikes in Syria. And in February of this year, the International Atomic Energy Agency warned that Iran had enriched radium to near weapons grade. The Biden administration called it alarming, but made no effort to sanction or penalize Iran. Iran is now very close to producing weapons grade enriched uranium. What's more, the Iranian nuclear facilities are deep underground, perhaps out of the reach of US and Israeli bunker busting bombs. Biden typically blamed the Trump administration for this and blamed the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA. But many of Iran's most egregious nuclear actions happened after Obama took office. And I think that there are a number of dangers there, not the least of which is that Western inaction probably increases the likelihood, or at least the possibility, of an Israeli strike. What's more, the Biden administration backed away from its promise early on not to seek a new agreement with Iran after their first attempt failed. The proposed agreement was that Iran would agree to halt enrichment at 60%, 90% is weapons grade. Iran would agree not to sell ballistic missiles to Russia. The US would give sanction relief. Iran would release US hostages. This is before this hostage deal took place. The fact is that the Iranians weren't interested in that. And as I said, Obama didn't seek a treaty because he knew it couldn't pass Congress, and Biden had no intention of submitting something like that to Congress, because again, Congress had better sense. In the meantime, Iran has expelled US nuclear inspectors, and Iranian oil exports increased several fold. Again, in 1920, Iranian oil exports were $7.9 billion. In 2021, 25.5 billion. In 2022, 42.6 billion. And finally, I want to talk about Saudi Arabia, because I think the Biden administration's handling of that relationship illustrates the unevenness and uncertainty of the administration's foreign policy. As a candidate and then later as president, Biden repeatedly excoriated the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, said he would make him a pariah. Mohammed bin Salman certainly has overseen substantial human rights violations. The Obama administration often cites the imprisonment of the regime's detractors, which is certainly a fact. The poorly prosecuted war in Yemen that killed too many civilians, and especially the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Less than 3 weeks after the inauguration, Biden ended the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. And when Iranian proxies attacked major industrial and oil centers in Saudi Arabia, the Biden administration seemed relatively unperturbed. They issued only a mild condemnation. This alienated Saudi Arabia, and certainly, I think, facilitated or gave energy to the Saudis' move toward China. Mohammed bin Salman now is prepared to proceed without the United States as its guarantor of security. Since World War II, the deal has basically been oil for security. The Saudis pump oil, sell it to Europeans and Americans. And in World War II, after World War II, Americans weren't such a big customer. But in exchange, the United States would guarantee security. Mohammed bin Salman has also looked to reestablish ties with Iran and Syria, and certainly his move to establish closer trade and other relations with China. The Biden administration alienated the Saudis, and then by cutting production of energy in this country, found itself in a difficult situation where they had to go beg the Saudis to increase oil production and received a resounding snub. In fact, the Saudis managed to reduce oil production. OPEC cut production by 1.16 million barrels per day. In July, the Saudis announced an additional 1 billion barrel a day cut. And I think the Biden administration lost a lot of energy in a lot of leverage in this with their energy policy. And I keep hearing that, well, we haven't really reduced our energy production. Well, according to the United States Department of Energy, the United States produced 12.8 million barrels a day in 2020. It produced 11.3 million barrels a day in February 22. And the peak was in 2019 when it produced 12.97 million barrels a day. That sounds to me like a reduction. Somebody can check my math, it's not that good. But as a consequence, you see Saudi overtures to China, including now establishing a deal for oil, not conducted in US dollars, but conducted in Chinese yuan. China brokered a deal between the Saudis and Iran. The two nations exchanged embassies, although not much has gone beyond that. And as Mehrdad pointed out last week, a soccer match led to almost a breakdown in relations between the two countries. And I think there's a lot more behind it. The soccer match a Saudi team was playing in Iran, and there was a statue of Soleimani there, and the Saudis walked out. All of this has consequences for the Abraham Accords. There have been talks to normalize Saudi relations with Israel. The US and the Saudis want the Israelis to make concessions to the Palestinians. Israel wants security guarantees from the US, and they were moving closer to accord until Hamas attacked on Saturday. And in that one respect, at least, the assault accomplished what it intended to do, which was throw a monkey wrench into that process. Biden still desperately wants a Saudi-Israeli accord, but I think the Biden administration picked the wrong targets for the wrong reasons. They're awfully impressed with themselves as moral crusaders. And as a result, they imported a kind of childish Manichaeanism, if that's a word, into the adult world of foreign policy, where most things are shades of gray, not black and white. Again, Biden said he would make the Saudis pariahs and then had to beg them for oil production. The Biden administration, some say turned on, I would say alienated America's friends in the region, and at the same time failed to convince America's enemies. Consequently, you see the Israelis, Saudis, and Turks looking more toward China. And so too does Iran. With respect to the Saudis, one can argue that Mohammed bin Salman is a murderer, and so he is. But so too, and to a much greater degree, is the Iranian regime, which Biden would like to establish closer relations with. With respect to the current crisis, I don't find very much to criticize the Biden administration on. On Saturday, the day of the initial assault, Biden early on issued a statement of support for Israel and condemned Hamas. Tuesday, he gave a clear and still stronger statement of support and condemned the savagery of Hamas. But the administration's initial responses, I think, are very revealing. And it's something to think about. On Saturday, the day Hamas launched the attack, the U.S. Office of Palestinian Affairs tweeted, "We unequivocally condemn the attack of Hamas terrorists and the loss of life that has occurred. We urge all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks." A little late to refrain from violence on the part of the Hamas butchery. It was directed at Israel. Don't retaliate. That tweet, by the way, was subsequently deleted. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on Sunday on X, formerly known as Twitter, wrote, or somebody wrote for him, "The Turkish foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, and I spoke further on Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. I encourage Turkey's advocacy for a ceasefire and the release of hostages held by Hamas immediately." It was taken down Monday morning. It's very revealing. It sounds so reasonable. Ceasefire. Let's stop killing people. It's a free pass for terror attacks. Once Israel struck back, Hamas indicated an interest in a ceasefire. They thought this wasn't the best idea. It's like a schoolyard bully who hits and then calls for a truce. That policy gives a free punch to the initial aggressor. Even in his speech yesterday, Biden failed to mention Iran. And the Biden administration maintains that they can't establish clear evidence of Iran's participation in the planning of this attack. Well, the Wall Street Journal claims that it can. They reported on Iranian involvement based on 4 sources, they say. The Biden administration does, however, say that Iran is complicit for funding and arming Hamas. And I think that's a constructive step. But even if one takes the administration on its own terms, the policies in the Middle East strike me as contradictory. Biden and Blinken acknowledge that China is the most serious long-term challenge to international order, and yet the administration's policy is not congruent with those stated aims of deterring the Chinese Communist Party. China and Iran both would like very much to overturn the US-dominated international order. And you see this in BRICS, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, founded in 2009, and then added South Africa a year later. That organization plans to develop its own currency to compete with the United States as a reserve currency. It calls for, quote, reform of the UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF. And this year, BRICS added Saudi Arabia, UAE, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina. There's a lot of GDP when you combine all of those countries. And the membership of Saudi Arabia and UAE is an indication of their drift away from the American orbit, which I think is unfortunate. I think you'd be hard put not to say that some of these policies have contradicted the stated aims. All of this leads at the very least to uncertainty. And in today's Middle East, uncertainty is dangerous. Thank you.
No, actually, you led with some very good introductions to what I'm going to be talking about. So, as I look at the countries: U.S., China, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. There's a common thread here: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. major energy producers. China, major energy importer. And Israel, a country that until recently did not have any natural resources to speak of. Their greatest attribute was their human capital, and still is. But recently, within the last 2 to 3 years, natural gas fields have been discovered off the coast of Israel and Lebanon. These natural gas fields are game changers in terms of import of a resource that currently they have to bring into the country, which can lead to, and inevitably, will probably help change some of the economic dynamics. What I want to speak to is understanding principles that are germane to your life on a daily basis and decisions that you're going to have to make, both individually and as a country. What are we willing to give up in order to get? The discussion is long-term. Anything that I say to you today is not offering short-term solutions. There'll be successes and there will be failures. But what I want to talk to you about is an old story, as old as humanity, the quest for security, energy security, and resource food security, as mentioned earlier by our guests. Keep that in mind as I move through this discussion. In modern times, if you go back to pre-World War I, Great Britain was a major coal producer. The war starts. The German Navy, unparalleled, had and used a different resource to fuel their ships. They used oil. Their ships were faster. There was a gentleman who recognized this, who was Minister of the Navy at that time, Sir Winston Churchill. And he said to the cabinet and other officials, we have to transform our use of coal and our Navy to an oil base if we're going to be able to compete with the Germans. That meant great resistance because, of course, Great Britain was a major coal producing country, did not have oil. That came decades later with discovery of oil in the northern fields off the coastal areas. That change led to a race in Europe that was industrializing. Automobiles were being introduced. Countries and businesses and industries were moving off of a coal-based type of an economy to one that used oil. The issue was, of course, did Europe have oil? No. Great Britain have oil? No. Where was the oil? Oil is, there's nothing new about the discovery of oil. Go back, China was using oil centuries ago in a different capacity, of course, than today. But the discovery of oil in the Caspian Basin, and then in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and various countries led to a race by the colonial powers to determine who would have control over this. You have to understand the political structures that existed in these countries and compare and contrast that with the situation that existed in the industrial European continent and in Great Britain. The US comes into the equation later, but not much later. Oil had been discovered in the US late 1800s, starting to replace coal and gas, or oil gas, I should say. And thankfully, the whales rejoiced because we were using them up in great quantities to extract their resource. So it probably saved the species in a very direct fashion. So as you move through this, the race to develop, which was only able to be done by the technology and the capital that existed in Europe. Agreements were made. Countries that didn't exist were made into countries. Sykes-Picot. I would urge all of you, if you want to know a little bit more about the history, to look at that agreement. Nobody asked if that could be the case. It was done. And it drew boundaries. That, of course, we're still dealing with the issues and the conflicts as a result of that today. Britain has a little place called Palestine. It was a protectorate. The Ottoman Empire is in decay. Great Britain has this protectorate. There were populations of Jews still living there, never left, but in much smaller numbers, and people that call themselves the Palestinians. So you're setting the stage decades and decades ago for the issues that you're still dealing with today. But now it's gotten more complicated. And why? By 2050, we're going to have another 2 billion people on the planet. The demand for electricity and all sources of energy are going to go up exponentially. That's going to include traditional fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, coal, and I even throw into the category something that I believe could be a game changer, but we have opposition to it, nuclear energy. And we're starting to see some changes in that as well. So as you're moving through this and you're realizing the common denominator is people look at us and say, look at the standard of living you've enjoyed for centuries, for decades in this country and others. But where is that population increase coming from? It's coming from the emerging economies, the developing economies that are moving up that ladder in terms of their standard of living, which is going to require massive amounts of resources. Where are those resources going to come from? And keep in mind, we don't pay enough attention to demographics. Demographics are the driver of economic prosperity or contraction. Think of the countries on the planet that are getting older versus the countries that are, in terms of where the percentage of their population falls, younger. And you see that mostly on the African continent, places in Asia, Latin America. The United States, we still have a positive birth rate. Most of that is due to immigration. Without immigration, our increase of population, i.e. the birth rate, would not be as robust. Japan is actually a country that may, in time, I don't think this happens, but its birth rate is declining so rapidly, they could literally become extinct. South Korea, also an incredibly aging country. China, I think you've probably heard this before. China is a country that even with 1.2, 1.3 billion people has a population problem. People look at you like, you're crazy. How can you have a population problem when you have over 1 billion people? When they're the wrong percentage of what constitutes your overall population and the resources that have to be allocated to take care of that population. India, if not already, will surpass China in terms of population. Their middle class alone is as large as the US population. It's not the same middle class as the US in terms of wealth, but it's growing rapidly. The point is, all of this is going to require more consumption of energy to meet people's most basic needs. Water, food, shelter. Where's it going to come from? And in the meantime, we're in this great transition. And it's a political, economic, and social transition of people saying, you've got to stop using fossil fuels. Look what it's doing to the environment, the conflicts, the wars, all that goes with it. Yes, it's a reality. But are we going to make that transition in 10 years, 30, 50, 70 years? I don't know. What I do know is the renewables are getting to be a larger percentage of the overall energy pie. But make no mistake, this transition is going to require even greater amounts of extraction of resources. So I ask all of you, the Central Republic of the old Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. Does anybody look to see how rare earth minerals are mined in that country? Are you comfortable with the fact that child labor is ubiquitous? Are you comfortable with the fact that China is a major producer of rare earth minerals? That's an existential threat to industries if they ever use that. And I don't know that they would, because I think the harm to them could be equally as great. But it's a matter of controlling your own destiny. If I told you in the United States, there are a number of sites with world-class reserves of rare earth minerals, would you believe it? Probably would. Are you willing to mine it? You're probably not. Better to get it from someplace else and feel good about it until you know the facts. So that's what I said earlier about having to make decisions. Now, where am I going with this as it relates to the Middle East? Saudi Arabia recognizes that their time as a major oil producer has a clock that's ticking. I don't know if it's 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but the curve is starting to be bent towards consumption for a number of different reasons. More efficiency. We are using about the same amount of oil as we did 20, 30 years ago, but our economy has grown exponentially. Why? Productivity efficiency across a whole spectrum, from housing to our industrial usage, to your refrigerator, your stove, automobiles. So you look at the geopolitical issues and you go, gee, why is it that the Saudis are in negotiations with Israel? Something that was unheard of and alluded to with the Abraham Accords. I think they recognize that cooperation, collaboration of resources is such that Israel is one of the world's leading innovators in technology, and most importantly, water. And what does the Middle East need, especially with climate change? That curve is being bent and in a very negative fashion. The impact will be exponentially growing in terms of water needs and usage. Technology has and provides great answers. AI, as somebody said to me today, you know that AI uses a tremendous amount of power, that just the use of your computers, those wonderful little instruments that changes the world. Do you ever stop to think about the amount of electricity that it takes? No. Do you ever think about where it comes from? No. All you want to know is it works. And the thing that upsets us is when our cable goes out, or we don't have access to the comforts that we've come long to enjoy. So look at the population in the Middle East, in these countries. They're young. Mirdad has said many times, Iran has a population that I believe about 3/4 is under the age of 30. Think about that for a minute. They have access to information just like you and I do. And they're living under a regime, an authoritarian, brutal regime. How long will it be? It's already showing signs of cracking. The Saudis, a young population. Changes are trying to be made, but it's not easy. Relationships are trying to be developed. Cities are being built using solar and other types of renewables as they're moving away from, I think, what they understand the inevitable day. Now, one of the interesting juxtapositions is, while they may actually be exporting less oil as that curve gets bent, does that mean that their ability to influence and their power declines? Would be a situation where you actually see, while we're using less, it's concentrated more in the hands of a few of the producers. As Mike said earlier, the United States, in terms of oil and energy production, leads the world. And that includes LNG, liquid natural gas. What happened there was a geopolitical issue. And this is when you think about these countries, I want you to be thinking about the geopolitical issues of energy. That's why I'm bringing this up to you. Russia invades Ukraine. Russia was and has been a major exporter of natural gas to Europe. Europe makes decisions to cut themselves off, not immediately, but reduce substantially their imports of natural gas. But where are they going to make up the difference? They had to start using more coal. Germany, against the policies of their government, in terms of the Green Party, has to start thinking about restarting nuclear facilities. Things that they had shut off. They had reduced their resiliency. And this is where this battle comes in. As I look at the Middle East, I look at the US, Russia, China, it's all interconnected, folks. One does not exist without the other. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm saying, where's the resiliency? How do we affect policy change? And I think one of the greatest ways we affect policy change in the Middle East is you take the power from the major oil exporters in that region. How? Because economically, when there's more oil either on the market or believed to come on the market, the prices come down. Unless there's a crisis in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz gets shut down, then all bets are off. And that's what you saw happen immediately when oil prices spiked, when Hamas committed its barbaric acts upon Israel. Oil immediately went up, not because there was less oil in the world, but the concern and fear of what could happen if this conflict widened. If Israel gets into it with Hezbollah, watch oil prices spike even further. If Iran starts making even more noise. I mean, I'm not going to say that this is some, grand scheme, because many times events simply happen in their own fashion. But what I've seen in my years of doing this is the fact that the markets will react very quickly to perceived shortages, driving up prices. Prices being higher means what to you? Higher fuel cost, higher food cost. And at a time when the Fed has raised interest rates to unprecedented levels in the last 25 years. We went from 0 rates of interest during COVID to now currently 7%. So what's the effect on housing, on your credit cards, people trying to get new homes, on their mortgages, the supply chains, everything flows through. And at the end of the day, you're a consumer. You're going to be paying more. Some can afford it, most cannot. And one of the ways that we could have bent that curve was bringing the cost of energy down. But when you signal to the markets that you are going to do and put policies in place that discourage more production, that's when the market's going to react. Is it short-term or long-term? Yet to be determined. But if you're dealing with policy issues in the Middle East and the power and money, where does Iran get its money from? Other than the fact we occasionally send them a few $billion. It's from oil and natural gas. And even though there are sanctions in place, oil is very fungible. It still gets out into the market. I can put it on another tanker. It's not even my tanker. I name it something else, and the money's still coming back to me. There's many different ways to circumvent those sanctions. How is Russia financing its current situation? Because of its wonderful products and services that it provides the world? No. We know why. Because of oil and gas exports. So when you start thinking about this, you have to think about all of this in its entirety and not as separate pieces. And how do you connect those pieces to make sense of this so that your policies are more in line, not that it will inevitably or immediately cause an effect, but I'd rather be in the position where I'm making decisions of how to affect these issues than letting somebody that is not a friendly country or regime make those decisions on our behalf. So I think about this and I go, all right, Israel, China, US, Saudi Arabia, Iran, I even throw Russia into the equation. This is a game that's been playing out for decades, if not centuries. What's going to change? The battle over resources, the allocation of resources, and the procurement, as China is desperate to do. And that is only going to get and grow in intensity in the years and decades to come. So I end this with saying to you, think about it. Consider what your role and responsibility is, because when you vote, you're making decisions of policies to be put in place that move forward, that have effects on this. I certainly don't have all the answers or even begin to think that I do, but I've seen patterns that have repeated itself over and over again. And for the life of me, I shake my head in disbelief because I ask myself, when are we going to learn? When are we going to get it? And what we tend to do is what Churchill said, you can count on America to do the right thing after it's exhausted every other option. And I kind of feel we're in that situation right now. If I tell you I don't believe in your existence and I'm going to do everything to make sure you don't exist, when are we going to get that they mean that? When Russia has been saying in terms of policies since the beginning of the early 1900s, that this is their grand vision, this is what they see as their natural right or empire, whatever it may be. And your president, Putin, writes a white paper clearly articulating what his views, thoughts, and intentions are. I don't want that to go to the Smithsonian for somebody to read 50 years from now. Pay attention to what they're saying. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Mike for outstanding presentation. Thank you, Bob, for another outstanding presentation. So you were wondering whether this will be the only slide. No, there is a PowerPoint coming. I will use this PowerPoint to highlight several issues with regard to US foreign policy that I think are important for us to include. But before I give this presentation, I want to forewarn you that I'm going to irritate both of you, Republicans and Democrats. Sorry, I have to always apologize. I don't know why. I thought freedom of press and expression is endemic to our culture, but apparently not. When I criticized President Trump's foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the Kurds and in southeastern Turkey, I was badly attacked, and I'm sure because today the White House is being occupied by a Democrat, I'm going to be probably labeled as a Trumpian. You never know these days. Labels come. So without any further ado, let's go over this. And I will look at it as a series of foreign policy agendas that we have seen, and building up on some of the excellent points that Mike brought up. First and foremost, it is extremely important for us to understand that the sequence of events that have led us to the present situation today in Israel started somewhere outside of Israel. Just like Mike, I have no illusion that the barbaric attacks by Hamas against Israel has anything to do with the Biden administration. Clearly not. Hamas has been planning this for months. The planning and the funding, we all know, though some people are trying to actually pretend that they don't. It comes directly from one country, and that is Iran. Hamas is a proxy of Iran, and Iran has been looking for an opportunity to use Hamas. And by the way, Hamas is not the only one. Another organization is sort of skipped over because they're much smaller, Islamic Jihad. They are also based in Gaza. They have been planning this. They have been training for it. I read, and I think I shared it with Mike and maybe even Bob, Hamas leaders have been in Tehran, the capital of Iran, at least 7 times in the last several months. And in one of these visits, as they were leaving Tehran, they were given bags, basically suitcases. And when they asked what these suitcases contained, they were asked to open the suitcase. And they opened the suitcase and it was covered with cash. And only 4 of the suitcases, 4 or 5 suitcases, contained $22 million in cash that they were given to actually take with them on the plane back to wherever they're going. They were going to Qatar. They actually live in 7-star hotels. They don't live in Gaza. And this is interesting. So when additional suitcases were brought, the pilot actually said that you cannot bring so many suitcases filled with cash. You need to actually hire another pilot to come back to Tehran and bring you the suitcases. So if somebody in the State Department is saying they don't know where the money for Hamas is coming, I can actually show you the YouTube link, which tells you right out to your face where the money is coming from. The money is coming from Tehran. And this discussion is about why Iran is so interested and so committed to helping Hamas. But in order to contextualize it in the larger foreign policy issue, why Iran has become so brazen, especially since 2021. And I think the issue is that much of the Middle East, basically, most of Middle Eastern countries, they actually organize their foreign policy in accordance with United States moves. United States is still the dominant power. Soviet Union is gone. China is trying to get in there, and it has made some inroads. But look, United States is the guarantors, or has been the guarantors, of peace and security in the region. So when the superpower, the sole superpower, United States, decides to withdraw from Afghanistan, in the minds, not as far as we are concerned, in the minds of those who run the governments of the region, this is considered to be a retreat. This is considered to be a disengagement act. That is, United States is moving out. And in addition to that, and this is very important to understand, is that when the president of the United States comes on, it was right, I remember, 4th of July is coming, he announces United States is leaving. Somebody asked the question from the media, well, do you think the Afghan army can stand up to Taliban if they come back and attack the Afghan army? And he says, look, it's 4th of July weekend. Of course, 70,000, Taliban cannot attack and overcome the Afghan army, which we have armed with billions of dollars. What happened? United States left at 4:30 in the morning, right? Without even notifying some of our Afghan allies. We withdrew. And that Afghan army, which we had trained for the last 20 years and supplied them with billions of dollars of the most sophisticated weaponry, collapsed without fighting. They didn't even fire shots, which tells you that Republican and Democrat, whatever the administration was, they worked on it, but they never had really a strategy with regard to Afghanistan. And that strategy had failed, whether you had a Republican in the White House or a Democrat. Why? Because we never thought deep down. And it comes out, if you read the studies on Afghanistan, we never had a commitment to stay there in the first place and do something, because we believe that Afghanistan can never become a nation state. Afghanistan is too tribal, too ethnically diverse, too linguistically diverse, too religiously diverse. You have the Pashtuns in the south, you have the Tajiks in the north, you have the Hazara in the center, you have the Turkmens and Uzbeks and the rest, just Baluchis and others. This is not a country which can ever become a nation state, and it doesn't have the economic resources worth fighting for. It doesn't have oil, it doesn't have gas. So for that reason, we were just politely trying to withdraw. Republican administrators reduce the numbers, Democratic administrators reduce the numbers, but we are still maintaining about 2,500 troops at the time when President Biden decided to withdraw all of them from Afghanistan. The joke in the White House, and the joke in Afghanistan too, of course, which is very famous, is that an American comes to Afghanistan and his minder basically comes to pick him up from the airport, right? And he says, what are you here for? He said, I'm writing a book, and he said, when did you arrive in Afghanistan? Is it your first day? He said, no, I arrived actually in Herat, yesterday, and so on and so forth. So also you arrived yesterday. So what can I do for you? He said, here's a list of 500 people I want to interview. I said, really? Okay. 500, that's a lot of people. He said, yes. And I need to interview them today. And he said, or early tomorrow morning. And the guy says, 500 people you want to interview today or tomorrow, and you're writing a book. Can I ask you, what is the title of your book? He said, yes, the title of the book is Afghanistan Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. So this is, the way we have kind of looked at Afghanistan, that Afghanistan is not worth our investment. So some people come to President Biden and he says the anniversary of 9/11 comes. There is pressure for withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. Let us do it right on the money at the date when we were hit by these terrorists and 9/11. So we have been there for 2 decades. Let's withdraw. We withdrew. But you have withdrawals and you have withdrawals. You can withdraw in very systematic, slow fashion. You can withdraw at 4:30 in the morning, and when your allies get up, they do not find you, which causes panic. It was disorganized, it was abrupt, it was panic-stricken. The result are these slides that we have all seen. People running on the tarmac, trying to, grab on the US planes and so on and so forth. And of course, several Afghan citizens died as a result of this abrupt withdrawal. But as a whole, when you look at this, we had to go back. It was so bad. It was so embarrassing. We had to send more planes to actually bring Afghan citizens out because we realized that while we had left physically, we had left Afghanistan, we had left behind tens of thousands of US citizens and green card holders. We are responsible to them to go back and pick them up and bring them out. That's why you have these scenes then, that you have planes full of Afghan citizens, being basically told to sit on the plane and being shipped out. And within matter of few days, basically, Taliban took over that multi-billion-dollar army that we had left behind for the Afghans to defend themselves. The result is today, Taliban-dominated Afghanistan has one of the best and most sophisticated US armed to the tune of apparently 75 to 80 billion dollars. An army was left in the hands of a terrorist state, which does not even recognize the existence of its women as human beings, right? Which has demoted its women to subhumans, which has closed down all elementary schools, all grade schools, all high schools, all colleges, and all universities. Where is the outrage of pro-women rights individuals in the Biden administration? I didn't hear anything from Vice President Harris in terms of the atrocious consequences of this withdrawal on women in Afghanistan. If women have rights in Afghanistan too. What happened to their rights? And why were those rights violated and the United States has done anything else to defend it? And Afghan women, as my friend Don Loringer can tell you, are extremely talented, are brilliant. We have several of them here, especially one, Shaima, who has just finished her PhD here, which tells you that they are amazing in terms of potentials, in terms of their brilliance. And all of this, what had happened, half of the population has been denied the most basic human rights. And what are we doing about this? And what is the consequence of this policy? And what we are told is, oh, it's going to become history. It's going to be a forgotten chapter because Americans don't care about Afghanistan. That's one issue. The second one, as Mike also alluded to, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, is a murderer. He ordered, there is no ifs or buts, he ordered the murder of a Saudi journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, who had become critical of Saudi foreign policy, but also, even more importantly, of Saudi's internal policies with regard to violations of human rights. Jamal Khashoggi had become a member of the Washington Post Bureau, right? And if you read his article, he's a brilliant journalist. He was invited, he was basically pulled into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He never left it. Maybe he left it, but he left it in pieces. They killed him, they suffocated him, then they chopped him. They actually sent a team to actually kill Khashoggi, tear his body into parts, and then throw the body parts into various areas in various parks in Istanbul, so nobody will find it. That's murder. That's terrorism. That's state-sponsored terrorism. We know that the Saudis have had one of the worst human rights records in the world, right? At the same time, we know something else, that the Saudis, as Mike alluded to correctly, are dependent for their security and the preservation of their system on United States. United States has a major base at Tehran. Without United States, you could not have a Saudi monarchy remaining in power. They know this very well. Because Tehran also is on the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, where the majority of population are Shia Muslims. Shia Muslims are far more loyal to Iran than to the Saudi monarchy. And next door, right north of the Persian Gulf, you have Iran. And the Saudis cannot handle Iran on their own. And it's not just Saudis. Bahrain cannot. United Arab Emirates cannot. Oman cannot. That's why you have the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, in order to create an alliance between the Arab states of the southern part of the Persian Gulf, backed by United States, trying to maintain their security against bullying of Iran. And before that, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So we know all these facts, and we know what the weakness of the Saudis are, and we go after it. And we hit him. Yes, we want to make him a pariah, right? But the Saudis are also, promised to basically punish Saudi Arabia, which actually made a big splash, of course. But then, of course, when you do this, you have to look at the consequences of what you do and the possibilities of things changing very quickly on the world stage. And what happened? Putin invaded Ukraine. And suddenly, right, that Russian oil and gas that Bob alluded to was not available in the international markets. Prices began to go up. Inflation began to show its ugly head, right? And United States administration, the Biden administration, was panic-stricken. So what happened? The same president who denounced the Saudis as pariahs had to rush, give this bump kind of thing. But in the secret meetings that unfolded, everybody knows what happened. The entire Middle Eastern, journalist structure knows, but somehow US media did not find it very interesting to cover. The United States begged Saudi Arabia to produce more oil. And you know what the response was? Nope, you're not going to do it. Because you actually embarrassed us in front of the world. Allies don't treat allies like this, right? Even if allies commit mistakes, even if allies commit murder, we can highlight a lot of murders and mayhem that you have created in the world stage. We didn't. We sort of ignored it. Now we committed a big mistake with regard to Khashoggi. What was the need for all this? You could have handled it differently. And especially, the Saudis had become very spoiled. You know why? Because the previous administration, the first thing that president did, he went to Saudi Arabia first. And then he went to Israel, right? And immediately, of course, there is money. And there is, of course, the military industrial complex that needs to be fed, right? So multi-billion-dollar contract for a lot of US companies. And the Saudis thought, as long as we write the big check, right? United States will be happy. Apparently not in this case. They wrote the big check, but we're still very critical of them. So, as Mike also alluded to correctly, the message was, you are not the only power in the world. We have other places to go to. And immediately they threw the red carpet for Xi Jinping, right? And the Chinese came. And the Chinese basically started a process that is still ongoing, signing a multi-billion-dollar series of contracts with the Saudi monarchy. And of course, we all know the last country to care about human rights is China, right? They're not going to complain. They're not going to raise any fuss about the murder of a journalist. And of course, this is very interesting. Even to make it worse for the Biden administration, the Saudis did something else. The Saudis agreed for the Chinese to act as the middleman to make peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the big challengers in the region, the big competitors, the big enemies in the Persian Gulf region. You know what that did? That opened the door to China to become a major power in the Middle East. We are not coming to Washington, we are coming to China. You know why? Because unlike you, Washington, the Chinese have the ability to work with us without criticizing our internal policies, and they have a very good relationship with Iran. And we believe that if China is the guarantor of an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Iranians will not dare attacking Aramco oil installations after this. The Saudis are very calculated. And they pulled a big one. And so, as Mike mentioned, they have a peace treaty or peace agreement. They are now opening embassies, but it's not a very deep alliance or agreement. Still, excuse me, over just showing the bust of Qasem Soleimani in a soccer match, the relationship can go south. That's how thin this agreement is. But China used our foreign policy mistakes in order to slam the door open, not close, but slam the door open in order to come in and play a leading role in the conflict between the Arab world and Iran. You see what is happening? What is happening is not that only China is winning diplomatically, but it's now, as this map shows, it is thinking about expanding the ancient Silk Road to Iran, to the Arab world, in order to expand. Our distinguished officers from Montana Army National Guard gave outstanding, excellent presentation about the Chinese impact in Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan is being swallowed. You know, last time we were in Tajikistan with Professor Kia, Arbi Kia, you know, here is a tunnel, right? That the Tajiks don't have the technology. Who is building the tunnel? The Iranians, right? But where are the Iranians? Oh, it was 4 o'clock. They have gone to Dushanbe for dinner. But who else is doing the work on the tunnel and the highway? At 10 in the evening, you had Chinese engineers, workers putting lights on the tunnel. Why? China and Iran are allies. They are cooperating in expanding Chinese influence into Central Asia. And guess what? There were truckloads of Chinese cheap laborers who are working on the tunnel. China is taking care of its own unemployment rate, bringing it down by investing in Central Asia. A country, by the way, that we still have not sent a single ambassador to who can speak the native tongue. The Chinese always send people who can speak Persian in Tajikistan, who can speak at least Turkish in one of the other four, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, or Turkmenistan. Whatever the case may be, that was the end of Mohammed bin Salman. He went even beyond that. After the invasion of Ukraine, he met with Putin and he offered his good offices as the mediator to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. And look, the photos were an opportunity to basically, I don't want to use a foul word in this very distinguished conference, but something resembling a finger to Washington. That I'm not only negotiating with the Chinese, I'm also negotiating with the Russians, and they love me. Third, we have, as Mike also alluded to, an issue of reviving Iran nuclear deal. This was basically a plan which was introduced under President Obama. There was an agreement signed, but as soon as the agreement was signed, we were receiving reports that Iran was already cheating. That it was violating the very promises it was making. So the Biden administration, which is in some ways the continuation of the Obama administration, actually had to deal with Iran because they wanted to revive it. In fact, we now know that someone by the name of John Kerry had told the Iranians, let this guy with orange hair go, you know, he's bad news for us, it's bad news for you. Once he goes, we will revive the agreement. And in the middle of all this, of course, you have a situation in Iran which erupts into a revolution, right? The Iranians are out. The Iranians are protesting. Women like freedom, right? 95% of the population in Iran, of which, as Bob mentioned, and there was an allusion by Mike, almost 70% of the population is below 30 years old. They despise this regime, right? Why? Because the average age of Iran's ruling elite, Ayatollah Khamenei and the rest of them, is deceased. They shouldn't be there in the first place. right? They have been in power since 1979. And the Iranians now, 59% of university graduates are women. They are dentists, doctors, surgeons, professors, journalists, writers, poets. They don't want to be ruled by these guys with turban and beard, who still want to create a country based on the teachings of the Quran, a holy book from 7th century AD. So you have this situation that Iran is fighting itself. The soul of Iran is divided, basically. Do we help the Iranians? Do we lend our support to the Iranian opposition? Once they had it in 2009 during the Green Revolution, this is not the first time, by the way. And the slogan on the streets of Tehran was, Obama, 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 are you with us or are you with them? And the answer was, let's negotiate with the Islamic regime. This is a fantastically educated, liberal-minded law graduate from Harvard. He preferred negotiating with this regime rather than lending support. All right. Now, too, instead of lending support to a democratic movement led by Iranian women, and I dare to say this is the first feminist revolution in the world. It's the first time that women are leading a social and political movement against the fascistic regime. Did we help them? I don't see it. Where is the help? So we engaged them. And the more we came to them, the more they went to the embrace of Moscow. This is Mr. Putin with Khamenei, and next to him, even a bigger masterpiece, Ibrahim Raisi, the president. Iran has a supreme leader. Iran also has below him a president. You know what that guy is? He was just in New York in September. He's a mass murderer. This is not me talking. This is the State Department of the United States saying. He's responsible for the death and execution based on 5-minute trials of nearly 5,000 Iranians, doctors, journalists, writers, poets. He was a member of the death committee, and now he's the president of the Islamic Republic. And this man is now the person we are working with. And in order to show that the closer you get to us, the farther you will get from us, guess who is in Syria? Who has been in Syria from the beginning when Assad began to be confronted with a civil war? It was really Russia and Iran which came to rescue. Iran built bases on land. Russians built bases on sea. They have naval bases. And from A to Z, they created a major Iranian asset in Syria. And even worse, what did they do? In order to antagonize Israel and United States, they went all the way to Hamas. This is Ismail Hania, the guy who lives in 7-star hotel rooms. For all of you anti-imperialists who really think Hamas is an anti-imperialist, anti-American organization, it's a business, Hamas. Anti-American, anti-Israeli politics is the best way to make money off of Iran, right? Acting as the agent, acting as the proxy of Iran. It's a big business. You get money, you create mayhem and violence. Iran can wash its hands and say, they're not involved. It's Hamas. It's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, really. And what have you done with those billions that you have received from Iran for the Palestinian people? When was the last time Hamas built a university, a college, a high school, a school for girls, which they have denied education to? When was the last time Hamas built a clinic? When was the last time Hamas built a hospital? So this relationship has now expanded to the fact that Iran is also supplying such missiles to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Why? Because Lebanon is just north of Syria. And these missiles in much greater number are in fact in Lebanon. That's the second option. Iran believes in asymmetrical warfare. It knows it does not have the military capability to confront United States and Israel face to face. They will destroy its military. So what do? You do it asymmetrical. You do it through proxies. You arm Hamas to teeth. You arm Hezbollah to teeth in Lebanon. In fact, Hezbollah is a much better force, much better trained force. And they have hundreds of thousands of more missiles than even Hamas. And already the attacks on Israel from north have started as a warning that if you come after Iran, we have more options to play with. So this is the reality. A cartoon can speak 1,000 words, right? The strings all end up in Tehran, the ally of China, the ally of Russia. And is it surprising that the only two countries which have not condemned Hamas are China and Russia? Right? They have not condemned it. Russia asked for ceasefire. Thank you very much. Russia is actually enjoying the fact that the focus on its own atrocities in Ukraine are not diverted by the war in Gaza. China has an excuse. We do not want to jeopardize our newly found influence in the Arab world by siding with Israel. Right? With friends like these who need enemy. So after months of secret negotiations with Iran, basically the Biden administration had to admit that it's not going anywhere. They are becoming closer to China. They're getting closer to Russia. So then we had another surprise in September. And I think this was the last signal which basically told Iran that the military option is off the table. They want to negotiate. They want to give us payments. And by the way, I speak as a person who despises wars. And by military option, I am not referring, though some people would like it to be that way, because I'm now critical of a Democratic administration. They would say, oh, he's a Trumpian. No, rest in peace. I'm not. Because the last thing I want is for United States armed forces to become engaged in one more conflict in that part of the world, and body bags returning of our finest. That's the last thing I want. At the same time, I'm originally from Iran, and I love that country too much to see it invaded. I don't want a single Iranian to die, and I don't want Iranians to fight. My new country, my new brothers and sisters, the American people. But in order to do that, you cannot negotiate. In order to avoid this, you cannot negotiate with the terrorist state and hand them $6 billion. What did we get? We get five US citizens. Not that I oppose that. I love hostages to be released. But the question is, they were all Iranian Americans. What were they doing in Iran in the first place? When they have been warned repeatedly, don't go to Iran. You know what they were doing? They were making money. Some of them were from Los Angeles, where the largest Iranian community is. They went to Iran, they got trapped. I'm very happy that they have been released. And in return, what did Iran get? Iran got 5 Iranians who are in US jails. But the irony of that situation was 3 of them, Iranians, refused to return to Iran. They wanted to stay in the United States. One of them jokingly said, I'd rather to be in jail in the United States than go back to Iran. There is. So this secret dealing goes back to the previous administration, $400 million at that point. And of course, these are some of the folks that we have released. Number 4, question of Russia. And this one, invading Ukraine. I have to tell you on this one, I'm completely with the Biden administration. I think Russia was pulled into this very intelligently in some ways, and it is trapped big time, and it has been hit in a most devastating fashion. Its reputation has been hurt. Its army has shown to be a complete nothing, basically. It is an army with no real capacity. And in this case, I actually believe that the Biden administration has played its card very wisely. Though I have to tell you something about it. When it started, we did not want to commit anything to the Ukrainians and President Zelensky, who is now a darling in Washington. The President of the United States called President Zelensky and asked how the United States can help him get out. And the famous answer from President Zelensky was, I don't want a taxi. I want arms to fight back. The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. And it was under pressure from citizens like you, from demonstrations in Germany, from demonstrations in France, from demonstrations in UK, from demonstrations in Poland, that forced the hand of the West, not only the United States, but its European allies, to actually come behind Zelensky. But last and not least, Israel, which is a very, very sensitive issue. And it is going to be a very complex situation to cover in a few minutes. You have to go back to ancient times. You have to go at least to the 19th century. And some of the agreements that were alluded to, Sykes-Picot, Balfour Declaration, Hussein McMahon correspondence, and so on and so forth. But this is the configuration of the country. As we were sitting in a car in Israel, our very, very good friend and driver stopped, and he had a map of Israel. He took a pen and he said, this is where we are. And the distance between where we are and where the West Bank is, where the Palestinians are, and the sea is as wide as this pen. That's Israeli security. Israelis are crazy about their security because they live in a very small country and it can be cut off very easily. It's that small. It's very small. And if it's cut off, its security, protection will collapse. I don't want to go into there's too much history. We teach it here. But Israel has had a war in 1948. Israel has had a war in 1967. Israel, as a result of the 67 war, came into possession of the West Bank, which was previously controlled by Jordan. It came to control a 30-mile strip called Gaza, which was controlled by Egypt. By the way, when Jordan controlled West Bank and Gaza was controlled by Egypt, I didn't see anyone throwing rocks either and demanding independence for the Palestinians. Although Jordanian and Egyptian rule were horrible. Israel took the holy city of Jerusalem. Israel expanded its territory. And the result has been since 67 that Israel is now facing what was referred to as the Palestinian question or the Palestinian problem. Before it was divided between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. After the 67 war, it became purely and exclusively the problem of Israel. The Israelis and the Palestinians have negotiated. Israel showed willingness to give up land, especially in the West Bank, and then it actually handed Gaza, that 30-mile sandy beach on the Mediterranean. But quickly after Israel gave it up to the Palestinian Authority, which is basically, i.e., PLO, the old PLO, under a new name. It was taken over by 2007 by a radical Islamist group called Hamas. And the result of this has been that Hamas has tried to convert this 30-mile strip, a beach basically on the Mediterranean Sea, as a base for attacks against Israel. Does that represent the aspirations of all Palestinians? Of course not. But whoever among the Palestinians has questioned Hamas has been found dead or had to disappear. Hamas is not an organization which believes in democracy, freedom of expression, open voting and open elections. Hamas is a terrorist organization backed by Iran. So Israel had returned Gaza to Palestinians in 2005, but the Palestinians to whom Israel had returned it lost Gaza. And since then, you have another phenomenon that Israel has to confront. A coalition between that very Palestinian Authority that Israel thought to be a peace partner and Hamas. And of course, the result of this is that at the same time, while all of this is unfolding, the relationship between Israel and United States have also gone through some very bad chapters. Prime Minister Netanyahu, horrible relationship with President Obama. Prime Minister Netanyahu opposed negotiations with Iran, opposed any form of pressure on Israel to recognize some form of negotiations with Hamas or other Palestinian organizations. So when the Trump administration came, there was an attempt initially to maybe reopen the negotiations by bringing everyone on board. But very quickly, the Trump administration gave up because they did not find Netanyahu willing to sit with them on the basis that they wanted and negotiate for a peace treaty. On that basis, the negotiations collapsed. And as a second option, the Trump administration went for something very different. That is the issue of negotiating a separate peace treaty between Israel and the Arab countries. Jared Kushner was sent, the Saudis became involved, Prime Minister Netanyahu became involved, and the result of all this was that the Palestinians now moved toward Europe to make their complaints to the French, to the Germans, to intervene. But the United States went under the Trump administration toward the Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords was basically leaving the Palestinians behind and make peace between Israel and Arab countries of North Africa and the Middle East. And this was very important because the first two countries to actually sign permanent peace with Israel were Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. From there, of course, the Abraham Accords went to create peace between Israel and Morocco, Israel and Sudan, and it was just moving toward bringing Saudi Arabia on board. But of course, the elections changed the whole configuration. And we come back to an administration which believes that the Palestinians should be brought on board. And of course, once again, negotiations were reinitiated. And Secretary of State Blinken met with the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas. But all of this has resulted to nothing. Negotiations have not worked. Mahmoud Abbas, the secular Palestinian leader, is weak, and Hamas has now been armed to its teeth and financed by Iran. And therefore, we have a war which is more or less being initiated, financed and armed by the Iranians through their ally, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Am I optimistic? Can anybody be optimistic under these circumstances? Can anybody see these scenes and think that there will be peace very soon in that part of the world? I don't think so. I think if we really want to be realistic, I think we are in a situation that the whole Abraham Accords, which had started bringing peace between the Arab countries and Israel, will be put on indefinite hold, because the Arab countries are not going to negotiate with Israel while Israel is attacking the Palestinians, or at least attacking a Palestinian organization named Hamas. It's just not going to work. And this time Israel is determined to go into Gaza and uproot and destroy Hamas, and not just leave Gaza back to Hamas returning. We don't know what will happen. It's very unpredictable. But I will finish with 3 reminders. First, Iran has not released all its assets. Lebanon still remains not completely quiet, but relatively quiet. They have Hezbollah, the party of God, which they can unleash against Israel. And Hezbollah is a much better force than Hamas. Second, and this is very important, the Arab world, which had started moving toward reconciliation with Israel, cannot continue with that process, because it's going to backfire on any government which actually makes peace with Israel while Israel is in battle with fellow Arabs. And third, as long as Russia and China are backing Iran, they will make sure that this conflict will continue and will keep United States distracted, busy, and focused on Gaza rather than elsewhere, especially the Russians, which want this to intensify so United States can be diverted from Ukraine. There are so many players with so many agenda, and we need to watch it carefully in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.